Versace was lured to the business and killed. Police are now investigating his links to WA's outlaw bikie gangs.
Executed inside an Angara shed, 34-year-old Joe Vase murdered at gunpoint.
It was a late September afternoon in 2022 when news broke of a shocking murder in a quiet, semi-rural area north of Perth. A man, Joe Vase, a father, and a figure with deep ties to the criminal underworld, had been shot dead in what seemed like a flash of violence. But Joe's life wasn't just any life. He was connected to gangs, drugs, and a world of tension that few ever fully understand. His story, filled with twists, betrayals, and tragic decisions, led to one killer, Joshua Du Perusal. But what led up to that fateful day? And how did a seemingly small debt turn into a deadly encounter? Stick around as we break down the shocking events that changed everything in just 15 minutes. Imagine a quiet, semi-rural area just outside of Perth, Australia, where the unthinkable happens on September 29th, 2022. It's a warm afternoon, but things are about to take a dark turn at a property with a criminal past. A shooting that would send shockwaves through not just the local community, but the whole underworld. A young man's life is cut short over a debt. This isn't your average murder. Oh no, this one has twists, connections to notorious gangs, and a mess of hidden truths that will unravel as we go deeper into the story. So, where did all this begin? Well, let's rewind to the early 2000s. In Nara, a man named Antonius Peter Chick, let's just call him TC, was running a mechanic shop. It seemed like a normal business, right? But when police raided his workshop, things got interesting. They didn't just find motorbikes. They found meth, LSD, cannabis, and a whole stash of other drugs. TC claimed that a group of tough, bicky-like men forced him into hiding all this gear. They even assaulted him, making it all seem like he had no choice in the matter. But the court wasn't convinced by his story. In the end, TC was sentenced to 11 years behind bars for his role in the drug trade. Fast forward 22 years, and that same property in Nara would once again be the center of a much darker event. Now, let's meet Joe Vase. Joe was 34 with a reputation as a tough guy in Perth's criminal scene. To his family, he was the guy you could count on. To others, he was someone you'd want to avoid. He had a long history with the law and wasn't exactly shy about getting involved in the underworld. Joe wasn't a stranger to trouble. Back in 2007, he had a motorcycle accident that nearly took his life. But surviving that crash didn't mean the end of his problems. In fact, it seemed like the accident started a downward spiral of bad decisions. Joe became hooked on drugs and faced several charges over the years. From possession to trafficking, burglary to theft, Joe's name was never far from the headlines. But despite all that, his sister, Connie, stood by him. She was the first to say, Joe was no angel, but he wasn't a monster either. On a GoFundMe page for his father's funeral, Connie wrote that Joe had tried to get clean, but just couldn't break free from the cycle. And while Joe's family insisted he wasn't a full-on criminal, they couldn't ignore the fact that his name was connected to some serious people. Joe was tied to Perth's dangerous bikie scene, people like the Rebels and Comancheros. He wasn't just in the game, he was part of the muscle. But things were about to get a lot worse for Joe. Enter Joshua Du Perusal, a 26-year-old with his own criminal history and a tie to the Rebels' bikie gang. Du Perusal wasn't a guy you'd want to mess with. He worked as a debt collector for the gang, which meant he had no problem using violence to get what he wanted. On September 29th, 2022, Du Perusal was ready to make a move on Joe. The reason? A $3,000 drug debt. Joe allegedly owed money, and Du Perusal was there to collect it. But what should have been a simple debt dispute turned into a deadly confrontation. Du Perusal came to the workshop that afternoon, armed and ready for trouble. He parked his black BMW 2 kilometers away, switched off his phone, and changed into dark clothing to disguise himself. He even wore gloves and a mask to make sure no one would recognize him. Armed with a loaded Luger 9mm pistol, he was all set for a showdown. Inside the workshop, Joe was up on the mezzanine floor with some others. When Du Perusal entered, he found Joe holding meth and cash. Just the sort of thing that would make anyone want to pull the trigger. The confrontation was immediate. Du Perusal demanded Joe hand over the drugs and money. Joe wasn't cooperating, and that's when things went south. The argument escalated quickly. Du Perusal fired 3 warning shots into the wall, but this didn't stop Joe. Instead, things turned physical, and in the struggle, Perusal fired again. This time, the bullet hit Joe straight in the eye, exiting just behind his ear. Joe fell, dead. In just 15 minutes, a father, a son, and a brother was gone. Perusal didn't stick around to see the aftermath. He grabbed some cash, ditched his BMW, and vanished. The crime scene was left in shock and chaos. His quick getaway left behind nothing but questions. Why did it escalate this far? What drove him to pull the trigger? The clock was ticking. Just minutes after Joe Vase's tragic death, chaos erupted at the workshop. 3 of the 4 men downstairs had already bolted for cover after hearing the gunshots, but one of them managed to gather himself and dialed emergency services. Time was critical, but tragically, by the time paramedics arrived at around 4:11 p.m., Joe had already been declared dead. It wasn't just a random murder, it was a calculated gangland-style execution, and as soon as the police were alerted, they knew that this wasn't going to be your typical investigation. With a gunshot wound that left Joe with a fatal head injury, there were immediate links to criminal organizations, and even more questions about how it had all gone down. Joe's death stirred up more than just grief. It raised questions about his involvement with Perth's notorious bikie gangs. The presence of Joe Ray Mundi, yes, Joe Ray, a senior member of the Rebels bikie gang, outside the crime scene, made it pretty clear that Joe was tied to the underworld. His appearance wasn't exactly a comforting sight, especially since the police had been cracking down on bikie gangs after the public execution of Nick Martin, the former Rebels boss, in 2020. Despite the speculations, Joe's family was quick to deny that he had any direct connections with the Rebels or any bikie gang. His sister Connie was adamant that Joe might not have been a saint, but he wasn't involved with the Hells Angels or any motorcycle gangs. For her, the bikie associations were more about who he knew, not what he did. However, the day of Joe's funeral on October 17th, 2022, painted a different picture. It wasn't just the coffin that stood out. It was the crowd. The service was packed with men covered in tattoos, wearing mullets, and dressed in clothes that screamed bikie culture. And while some high-profile members of the Rebels gang stayed away, those who attended weren't exactly making a quiet statement. The absence of certain figures, though, spoke volumes. Police had to monitor the funeral closely, noting the presence of people who wore ankle monitors, or were under strict orders not to consort with known criminals. Despite all the attention, one person was notably missing from the scene: Joe Ray. The senior Rebels member didn't show up. It left everyone wondering, was he involved with Joe in some way? Were these bikie ties more significant than the family was letting on? In the days following the murder, the police launched a manhunt for Perusal, who had gone into hiding. They weren't wasting any time. Public appeals for information were broadcast everywhere. They even circulated his photo in hopes of tracking him down. The raids weren't just focused on finding Perusal. They were part of a broader effort to clamp down on bikie-related activity in the region. But while the police were working their angles, Perusal was staying hidden. That was until October 3rd, just a few days after the murder, when the manhunt took a strange turn. Picture this. A woman in Belmont Park sees a man approach her and ask for a sandwich. Nothing too unusual so far, right? But then this guy says something that catches her off guard. He tells her he's wanted by the police and he wants to turn himself in. The woman, obviously alarmed, calls the police, who rush to the scene and arrest Perusal without incident. It was a bizarre moment, a wanted man casually admitting to his crimes while asking for a snack. The arrest was caught on camera, and the whole thing was oddly anticlimactic. There were no high-speed chases or dramatic standoffs. It was just a guy who had apparently realized that his time was up. But one thing about Perusal's surrender was strange. When he was arrested, he didn't have the weapon on him. The gun that killed Joe was still out there, and Perusal couldn't even remember where he'd left it. He later told police that he'd simply forgotten where he'd put it. Talk about a bizarre confession, right? And while Perusal's arrest was the first step in a lengthy process, it didn't stop the public from wondering why it all went so far. Was this all just about the money, or was it something deeper, a result of loyalty to the Rebels gang, the drug debts, and the murky world they lived in? Whatever the cause, it was clear that this wasn't a simple case. It was a complex story with many moving parts. The arrest of Joshua Perusal was just the beginning of what would become a long and dramatic saga. After being caught turning himself in at that park, Perusal was quickly thrown into the legal system. He didn't waste any time appearing in court. The very next day, he faced a magistrate for the first time. And guess what? When his past was mentioned, Perusal didn't mince words. He stood up and declared that his involvement with the rebels' Bicky gang had nothing to do with his current situation. He insisted this wasn't some Bicky gang hit or a debt collection gone wrong. No, this was all personal. He tried to distance himself from the underworld, trying to paint the murder of Joe Vase as a one-off, unrelated to any gang affiliations. But here's where things got complicated. The evidence didn't exactly back up his claims. Police soon uncovered that Perusal wasn't just some innocent civilian who had found himself in a tough situation. No, it turned out that he had been deeply involved with the rebels' Bicky gang as a debt collector. He had been working for them, running errands that involved drugs, money, and more shady dealings. He wasn't just a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time, he was part of a much darker world. In fact, Perusal admitted as much during his initial police interview. He confessed that there had been some bad blood between him and Joe over a $3,000 drug debt. Now, we don't know for sure whether that debt was ever legitimate. It was never really proven in court, but it's clear that this was the trigger for the deadly altercation. Perusal went to the workshop that day, not just to confront Joe, but to try and recover that money. And as he later told police, he brought a gun with it. Why? Protection. He feared Joe might be armed too, but Perusal insisted. He had no intention of using the gun. It was just for security, he claimed. But we all know how that story turned out. In the midst of the argument, the situation quickly escalated. There was a struggle, and in the heat of the moment, Perusal fired. A fatal shot, and that was it. Joe was gone. Initially, Perusal pleaded not guilty to murder. He stuck to his story that the shooting had been a result of the struggle, that it had been an accident, not premeditated. His lawyer argued that he wasn't intending to kill Joe, that it was just a tragic turn of events. But despite this defense, there was mounting evidence against him that seemed pretty undeniable. Fast forward to October 2023, about a year after the shooting, and things took an unexpected turn. Perusal made a stunning move in court. He changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. Why? Well, his lawyer, Luka Margarich, hinted that there had been some serious discussions behind the scenes. After a pre-trial conference and reviewing the evidence, it seemed like Perusal had come to a hard realization. The case against him was pretty strong, and with the change in plea, he could avoid a long, drawn-out trial. He had probably realized that he didn't have much of a leg to stand on, and by pleading guilty, he could speed up the process. But this decision wasn't just about saving time, it also meant he'd be facing the consequences of his actions. This wasn't a minor charge. Perusal was facing life in prison, and he knew it. The guilty plea was a step towards finally confronting the weight of his crime. The decision shocked many people. It meant there would be no trial, no courtroom drama where all the details of Joe's death would be laid bare for everyone to hear. But it also spared Joe's family from the trauma of having to relive the horror in front of a judge and jury. It seemed like a small victory for them, even if it didn't bring Joe back. Now, with the guilty plea, the court was ready to move straight to sentencing. No more delays. The wheels of justice were turning, and Perusal's fate would soon be sealed. But the big question still lingered. What would the sentence be? How long would Perusal be behind bars? Could the family ever find closure? The day of reckoning had arrived. After Joshua Perusal's surprising decision to change his plea to guilty, there was no more dragging this out. The trial, the legal battles, all of that was over. Now, it was time to face the music. And for Joe Vase's family, this was the moment they had been waiting for, even if it didn't bring Joe back. On the 27th of February, 2024, the Supreme Court of Western Australia was packed. This wasn't just any other sentencing day. This was the day that Perusal would finally learn the consequences of his actions. The man who had taken Joe's life, a father, a brother, a son, he was about to stand before a judge who would decide his fate. Justice Anthony Derrick took the lead in the courtroom. He wasn't one for making light of the situation. This was a serious case, and everyone knew it. The murder of Joe Vase wasn't just some crime of passion. It was premeditated, reckless, and deeply violent. Perusal had brought a loaded gun to that workshop, gone there with the clear intention of collecting a drug debt, and things had spiraled out of control. But here's the kicker. Justice Derrick emphasized something important. Even if Perusal hadn't intended to kill Joe, he was still responsible for what happened. Why? Because, as the judge pointed out, the whole situation had been a reckless disaster, and Perusal had fired a gun in a moment of chaos. When you discharge a firearm in that way, there's no telling what the outcome will be. Unfortunately for Joe, the outcome was fatal. But the core of the case wasn't about whether Perusal had meant to kill Joe. The core of it was that he had acted recklessly, and his actions had led to a death that could have been prevented. As Perusal stood there in the dock, the court also had to consider his background. While the court had already acknowledged that his involvement with the rebels' Bicky gang wasn't directly linked to the murder, it wasn't entirely irrelevant. It didn't matter whether Joe was connected to the Bicky world or not. What mattered was that Perusal had been operating within that world for years. He wasn't some innocent guy who got swept into a bad situation. He was a debt collector for the rebels, and he had ties to the criminal underworld. But none of that, according to the judge, could be blamed for Joe's death. It was Perusal's own reckless actions that had sealed Joe's fate. Then came the big moment, the sentencing. Perusal had been facing life imprisonment from the start, but now it was official. He was handed a life sentence with a non-parole period of 14 years. That meant he would spend at least 14 years behind bars before he could even begin to think about parole. A life sentence, but not life without the possibility of release. For Joe's family, the sentence was a bittersweet victory. While they had fought for justice, it wasn't the same as getting Joe back. His mother, Maran, expressed some relief, stating that they'd finally gotten justice. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. But Joe's sister wasn't as convinced. She didn't feel the sentence was enough. Her grief ran deep. She recalled the dreams she had of Joe walking her down the aisle one day. That moment would never come. Joe was gone, and nothing could bring him back. But for one person, the loss hit harder than anyone could imagine: Joe's daughter. She was just 14 years old when her father was murdered, and now she was going to grow up without him. No father to guide her, to teach her, to walk her through life's milestones. The ripple effect of Joe's death wasn't just felt by his family, it was felt by everyone who loved him, and especially by his daughter, who would have to face the rest of her life without him by her side. It's a tragic, sobering reminder of how violence doesn't just take one life, it affects everyone around that person. By the time Perusal is eligible for parole, Joe's daughter will be in her late 20s, and who knows what kind of person she'll be by then. Her life will undoubtedly be shaped by the loss of her father. As the court's gavel came down, marking the official end of the legal battle, the emotional aftermath for Joe's family was far from over. The sentencing had brought some sense of closure, but as any victim's family will tell you, justice doesn't fill the void left by a loved one. It doesn't bring them back, and it doesn't erase the pain. For Joe's family, the journey didn't stop when Perusal was sentenced. The echoes of Joe's life and his tragic death would continue to reverberate through their lives in ways that were hard to put into words. His mother, Maran, said they'd gotten justice, but it wasn't the same as having Joe back. His sister, still raw with grief, had trouble accepting the finality of it all. The sentencing was supposed to provide some form of peace, but instead, it just brought more reminders of what they'd lost. For Joe's family, this wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of a future. They had visions of birthdays, holidays, and weddings that would never happen now. Then, there was Joe's daughter. It was impossible to overstate the depth of the tragedy for her. At just 14, she was left to navigate life without her father. That's a loss that changes you, shapes you, and stays with you forever. As she grew older, she'd have to come to terms with the fact that the father she should have had growing up wasn't there to help her through the ups and downs of life. His absence would be a constant shadow, a reminder of the senseless violence that had taken him away. But it wasn't just Joe's immediate family that was affected. The entire community that had known him, even those who didn't see him as a saint, felt the ripple effect of his death. As the news spread, whispers of Joe's connections to the world of outlaw motorcycle gangs took over the headlines. While Joe's family firmly denied these associations, it didn't stop the media from speculating about the reasons behind his murder. And while the court ultimately determined that Perusal's actions were personal and not directly tied to gang activity, the stigma of the bikie connection loomed large, even though there was no solid proof to back up these claims. For Perusal, the consequences of his actions were obvious. His life had changed in an instant. He was facing years behind bars, and even after his non-parole period was up, the weight of his crime would follow him. There's no real escaping a crime like that. There's no magic moment where everything goes back to normal. And even though he admitted guilt and spared Joe's family the trauma of a full trial, that doesn't mean he was off the hook. The fact that he was once part of the rebels' Bicky gang only added another layer of complexity to his story. But in the end, the truth was simple. His choices had led to Joe's death. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. Joe's story serves as a tragic reminder of the consequences of violence and the ripple effects it leaves behind. One reckless act, a shooting, a death, a family torn apart, can impact so many lives in ways that stretch far beyond the victim. And in the end, the people who pay the highest price are the ones left behind. It's easy to look at a story like this and see it as a simple tale of revenge, money, and gangs. But it's much more than that. At its core, this is a story of loss, of lives forever changed by a single moment. It's a story of loyalty, but also of regret. A story of someone who thought he could resolve a debt with violence and paid the ultimate price. And at the center of it all, a family who will never truly heal, because you can't heal from losing someone you loved in such a senseless way. As the years pass, Joe's family will continue to carry his memory with them. They'll remember the man he was, the dreams he had, and the future that was taken from him. His daughter will grow up, and maybe one day she'll find some peace. But that peace won't come easily. The scars left by this tragedy will never fully fade. For Perusal, the reality of what he did will follow him for the rest of his life. The decision to take another person's life is one that can never be undone, no matter how much time passes. The law may say that he'll be eligible for parole, but there's no parole from the guilt, the regret, and the knowledge that he stole someone else's future in the most brutal of ways. Joe Vase's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a lesson about the consequences of violence, about how one moment can change everything, and about the deep, lasting impact it has on everyone involved. The violence that took Joe's life affected not just him, but everyone who knew him, and especially his family, who will carry this loss for the rest of their lives. At the end of the day, no amount of justice can undo what happened. No sentence can bring Joe back. But perhaps, in some small way, this story can serve as a reminder to us all. Choices matter. Actions have consequences. And we must always remember the people we could hurt with our decisions. Joe's story will live on in the hearts of those who loved him, and in the tragic reminder that life can change in an instant, and we must be careful with every step we take.